Welcome to Next Economy Now. I'm Erin Axelrod, a partner at Lift Economy. The goal of this podcast is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, transparent, and whole systems approach to using business as a force for good.
Massey Burke is a designer builder who works with natural materials in construction. She advocates for and expands the use of beautiful, natural, carbon sequestering materials in buildings. Her ecological interests began with wilderness restoration and grew into a decade of hands-on natural construction. And she still thinks of natural building as ecological restoration for humanity. This work, in turn, has expanded into developing technical information for natural materials, structural research and testing, carbon footprinting, design, and work on building codes for ecological materials. We are so honored here at Lift Economy to be working with Massey Burke on a pilot project for a vision for a climate beneficial fire rebuild to bolster the resilience of California's built environment and beyond. Without further ado, Massey Burke, welcome to Next Economy Now.
Massey, welcome to Next Economy Now. It's so great to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So we have been working together for a little while, and I'd love for you to start off our listeners as we dive into this vision for climate beneficial buildings. I'd love for you to start by sharing, what is natural building?
Okay, so to back up a little bit, my work is as a natural builder, as someone who specializes in knowing how to use natural materials in buildings. And earlier this year, many of us realized that we could bring several threads together, including natural building, in a way that might really allow a jump forward in the quality of the built environment as we rebuild from the fires. So that's what we're talking about.
So, Massey, tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into this, and maybe you can go from there into describing for our listeners what is natural building.
Yeah, so I have been a practicing natural builder for over a decade, which means a mix of hands-on building and design, and actually now research work, all pertaining to using natural building. And what that means is employing plant-based or mineral-based materials in construction that have had very little industrial processing. And they tend to be renewable and also compostable at the end of their lives. And some examples of this would be clay soils. The most common natural materials in building are clay soils, straw, wood, stone, bamboo, hemp, sand, gravel, and actually many other things, but those are probably the most common natural materials.
Great. So you got into this natural building as a practically, and how has it evolved since you began? How has your thinking around this evolved, and where do you hope to see this your work go?
Well, it's actually been really interesting. I'd say the whole movement has evolved, and hopefully my thinking along with it. But when I began, I and most other people were really interested in what I would call a very grassroots vision, which is still true. But I think we were all pretty interested in how to build for ourselves, and maybe in fairly specific contexts. I think the prevailing idea for a long time was really backing away from the prevailing culture and building an ecological culture that way. And I think most of us have since, pretty early on, I began to get more interested in how to bring natural construction into a wider context, into urban contexts, into combination with mainstream materials, into parts of the culture where people aren't thinking about this stuff. That became a much more interesting creative challenge, both for myself and also for, I think, a lot of people who began building hands-on. And of course, part of that, with that comes addressing, if you're going to talk about cutting-edge natural building, you have to talk about climate change.
So how does that relate to climate change, and maybe show us how it relates currently in our built environment?
To know how to think about buildings and climate change, you got to know three things. You have to be able to think about three categories of things related to building. The first is that in the big picture, constructing and operating buildings in the United States is responsible for about half of our fossil fuel emissions annually. And so it's a very high leverage part of our lives to invest inquiry into when we're thinking about how to combat climate change. And the other two things you have to know are where the impact of those buildings, how the impact breaks down. And so there's the impact of making the building, which is the embodied carbon of the materials. So the emissions associated with making and transporting building materials and constructing the building. And the second category is what's called performance or operational emissions. So it's the impact of living in the building over time and all of the energy that requires. And so thinking about how those things can be combined most effectively is how we get to what's called, or what people are calling now, real zero. So buildings that actually are zero carbon emissions, both in their materials in their construction phase and in the way that they're inhabited. And natural materials have a lot to contribute to that, which I'll talk about in a sec. But it's interesting to think about if you're employing the best case scenario, how much carbon can you sequester in the building if you're using carbon sequestering materials, and you're also using cutting edge technologies that prevent a building from emitting a lot of carbon dioxide over its lifespan. And one possible answer to that, and people are employing different modeling scenarios to try to answer that question, but according to New Frameworks Construction, which is a building also specializes in natural building, their best case scenario model suggests that a modest size house that's meant to be carbon sequestering could sequester up to 9 tons of carbon, which is roughly equivalent to the emissions to the equivalent of 2 cars' annual emissions, to give you a sense of scale.
Wow. Right. So we're thinking about, a concrete-based house with the most beautiful concrete wall structure could be fire resilient, but that would have a lot of embodied energy. Yeah. And then maybe it would have less energy over the lifespan, but you're really kind of balancing both of those two pieces and really thinking, how can we actually, so how do we sequester carbon in the building envelope?
Well, this gets back to natural materials. So when you use something that's plant-based as a building material, it sequesters carbon actually in 2 ways in that process. One, when you fill up the walls of a building with something like straw, which is one thing we do in natural building to insulate, that straw has carbon in it. So when the plants that produce straw grow, they're drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turning it into stable carbon in the body of the plant material. And that carbon remains in that plant until the plant breaks down. But when you're putting straw into the walls of a building, your main objective is for the straw not to break down. And so to serve its structural purpose or its insulating purpose. And so what you have then is a carbon sink. You have carbon that has been removed from the atmosphere by the plant and stored in the building while accomplishing a bunch of other things as well. If you are obtaining that straw from a sustainable agricultural source, the process of growing that straw is very likely also sequestering carbon in the soil. And so when you get into natural materials, their supply chains tend to be almost entirely the ecosystems that produce them. And increasingly, we're learning with croplands that produce straw, with forests that produce wood, how we understand the carbon cycling of those ecosystems is actually a really great opportunity for carbon sequestration as well.
So you mentioned that there are a lot of people in this field that are doing modeling to understand the carbon sequestration. Can you talk a little bit about your collaboration with Piscina's Ranch and how you're thinking about what your work, what you can add to this thought body?
Yeah, so my work until I did a couple of different kinds of work for Piscina's Ranch, which is a large ranch south of the Bay that's focused on the development of different types of regenerative land management, croplands and rangeland management. And in that process, I spent a lot of time with the ranch manager and the crew and the owner of the ranch, Sally. And that was really my in-depth introduction to supply chains for things like straw and the potential for those supply chains, and really beginning to think about the ecosystem end of natural building. We know that natural building materials are about as low impact as you can get from a materials perspective. But until then, I hadn't really spent much time thinking about the production perspective of materials. And Piscina's is really That's really what they're all about. And more than even studying it, they're about the creative development of, polyculture croplands that increase our ability to sequester carbon, both quickly in volume and also over time.
Nice. So you're actually looking at, okay, where does the straw come from in California? How could we use the built environment to support more producers to grow things in even more regenerative ways? And how can we bring more of those carbon-based materials into our building envelopes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a really great opportunity. I mean, just to be clear, most straw now is produced through industrial agriculture and is considered a waste product. And even so, it still sequesters carbon in a building. But I feel that we can go way beyond that. And we have also this opportunity to create a supportive market for materials from regenerative agriculture by increasing our use of carbon-based materials in buildings as well.
Right. I think David Arkin mentioned that we have enough industrial waste straw right now to build 200,000 homes a year in California out of straw.
We're not going to run out of it. Yeah. So what's cool about that too is that we can work on both ends of the puzzle, right? There's a lot of creative development that straw-based construction is, now quite developed, and there's still more that we can do with it, so we can work on that end because there's not really a materials supply issue. And at the same time, we can work on the supply chain ends and increasing the proportion of regeneratively produced straw as well at the same time.
So the materials supply issue brings me to our next theme, which is looking at the rebuild across California due to the homes that have been devastated and destroyed because of the wildfire season this past year. I have heard a lot about lack of material availability, the reduction in supply available to rebuild our communities. What is your vision for how natural building could play a role in the fire rebuilds, both in Northern and Southern California and beyond?
Yeah, well, I think we have, it's awful to say, but disasters offer a certain type of opportunity. And I think what is interesting to the whole green building community in California is how to support at least aspects of the rebuild process to be as green as they possibly can be. In great part because the people who are actually dealing with the rebuilding I think they want that, or a lot of people want that, but it's the last thing they have the bandwidth to deal with. And you alluded to material shortages, and there are a lot of challenges surrounding the fire rebuild process, shortage of labor, all sorts of site-specific issues like the water issue in Fountain Grove and or the water infrastructure issue there that I think suggests that we need that the rebuild needs outside, and then of course under insurance, which is rampant, that suggests that we need to find a way to bring other outside resources and ideas to the fire rebuild process, regardless of wanting to make it really green. And so I think one of the opportunities that we have in this rebuild is to say, well, there's a shortfall of all sorts of things needed to rebuild well. So how do we begin to build more energy around models for building and examples for cutting edge green building that are relevant to everybody nationally, in California, places that aren't rebuilding from fire, that could really bring in other resources and other energy and other interests to a rebuild that needs extra support and is in great part for a demographic that already wants to be as green as possible.
Right. And how do natural materials perform in fire? Because you mentioned the water infrastructure issue in Fountain Grove, and that's essentially molten pipes because they're plastic based, and there's lots of other issues that we've seen around the lack of our communities of being built not in a fire literate way. So we're now dealing with the repercussions. So how does natural material stand up in that context?
Natural materials, I mean, of course, that's a wide range of materials, but we would be most likely employing a combination of wood structure and straw or straw and clay infill for the specific designs that we've been contemplating. But there are a lot of great examples of straw bale buildings that came through the fire. And these can be, there's an article about this on the California Straw Building Association website, www.strawbuilding.org, that offers examples of several bale buildings that did survive and why, and then a few that didn't. I mean, they're not invincible to fire, but well-plastered straw buildings there's not really a good opportunity for oxygen to get into the walls. And if that's the case, they can't burn. And so I think my favorite photo of one of the straw bale buildings was of, you can tell that the whole landscape around it has burned. And there's a bumpy discolored section on the side of the wall where firewood was stacked against the building, and the firewood burned and the building did not. And then where natural buildings burn, it's often for the same reasons that conventional buildings burned. So sparks got sucked in through vents, either in the floor or the roof, or there was something flammable really close to a window that caught fire just simply from the heat. And then once you get combustion inside the building, most buildings are going to be vulnerable to that. But in general, a well-detailed, naturally based building based in natural construction is going to be fire resilient.
That seems like it would be one of the major reasons that more people would be catalyzing interest around this. I understand that another concern about natural building is the affordability. Could you speak to historically and maybe why that has been, and how can we look now and into the future to make natural building more affordable?
Yeah, and actually I just thought of one more point about natural building and fire. The other real advantage to natural building is that if it does burn, it doesn't produce a lot of toxic material afterward. So ideally it doesn't burn, but that a bale building that burns is not producing some of the problems that we've had with conventional buildings burning and the aftermath of that. So cost of natural material, it's just really interesting because, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the podcast, but a lot of us, when I began learning how to do this, it was still very much a DIY, hands-on, build for yourself movement. And then in the Bay Area in particular, there is a small, really, actually not so small anymore, but relatively concentrated group of designers who have been specifically, architectural offices and engineers who have been working with these materials for 20 years or more in some cases. And so those two groups have really been the driving forces behind most of what's been built until very recently. So you either have people building for themselves, often in pretty remote places, though not so much anymore. And then you have specific architectural offices who are constructing often custom buildings because that's their brand and their clientele. And we have an opportunity, and that's not the whole spectrum, but it's a lot of it. And so that's what's been driving the market until very recently. And so really what we have an opportunity for is the creation of simple design that has a lot to do with how much a building costs. And that's not difficult to do. That hasn't been a big share of the market yet. But I foresee that high performance, low carbon buildings combined with increasing awareness and desire for natural construction and healthy construction are going to change that very rapidly. And you're already starting to see that in Europe. There's industrial forms of straw construction. Industrial is probably the wrong word, but more streamlined pre-manufactured products that use straw that are still very ecological in construction. And so this next part of the movement is beginning to take root.
So how else can natural building contribute to long-term community resiliency?
I think there's a lot of ways, actually. But one thing that's of particular interest to me is two things, labor and also supply chains that we talked about. And so I think specifically in the case of Northern California, we already have a pretty small but well-established community of regenerative agriculture. And I think, not to go too far into what that's like, but what characterizes regenerative farming, monetizing that process, is that you'll have several yields from one cropland or one set of fields. And so the marketing is different. And I think the more we can do to offer supportive markets for the products of regenerative agriculture, the more we're contributing to the stability and resilience of those practitioners within the community, and also expanding the appeal for more people to adopt those practices. So, carbon favorable practices for soil, which is important even if we aren't dealing with climate change, for good agriculture. And so I think that's one opportunity. And the other is that with natural building, you have opportunities for unusual labor. So in this case, we would need designs that employ the conventional labor pool as well, of course. But because natural materials are relatively straightforward to work with, if you have a skilled leader for the parts of the project, you can bring in design students that want hands-on experience. A wonderful model for this that I've loved for years is Rural Studio, where students go and live in communities and design and build for them as a part of their design degree, which I think is really important. And there's actually a lot of interest in that kind of experience. And the other is training local workforces to have a greater range of skills. So there are definitely community colleges in Santa Rosa that would be, I think, really interested. Actually, I've heard will be very interested in including some of these building skills as a part of their training process to expand people's ability to build green and their awareness of building green, and the flexibility of their skill set. And so I think that's a really great opportunity that we have for this fire rebuild.
So this podcast is really just meant to give our listeners just a taste to get involved. We're going to be launching a call to action for community members to start contributing in a much more robust way. But just to kind of bring our conversation to a close, could you give a taste for people of what might be the phased plan for starting to implement having more of these concepts out in the vernacular, in the architectural community, in the rebuild dialogue, and maybe even some of your thoughts around what is next for this coalition?
Yeah. Well, I think we do want to do a little bit of prototyping, not so much for testing building techniques, but for modeling and financial modeling. And we also have some work to do around what the development model looks like. Like what do we need to enable all the parts of a build that's scaled up a bit? And so there's some conceptual work that we're in the middle of and need to get further with, I think, before we really tackle a big part of the rebuilds. But we would love to find several good opportunities for prototyping simple, affordable, natural designs, and both to double check the cost structure around that, and then also to give people physical examples of what this would be like before we endeavor to scale up. We also are in conversation with several community members around what a community-driven development model would look like. What do people want? What does it mean to bring these ideas in support of the community rather than imposing them on the community? And so there are a lot of diverse conversations going on about this, and we're bringing some of those together to really try to answer those questions. And then also bringing in the agriculture community once, I think probably a little bit down the road, like what do you guys want for a market? Like, how can we be most supportive? How can these endeavors be combined most effectively? The growth of regenerative agriculture and the growth of natural construction. So that's what I see as the next immediate steps. More community building, and then beginning the prototype design process, and then going from there.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, Massey. Thank you for really exercising your voice and the voice of experience, having built dozens. How many dozens of houses have you contributed to?
Houses, parts of houses, I don't know.
And just really acting in service. I think there's a lot of certainly trauma around the fires, and I think your voice is just such a gift to the people that are really thinking. And it's not uncommon to hear people say in Sonoma County, and I'm sure in Southern California too, we want to really make a difference in terms of rebuilding in a different way and thinking about a different way of sheltering our communities. So looking forward to the road ahead.
Yeah, we really want to support that. Thank you for all your work as well. It's amazing to have the combination of all these communities coming together, and you guys have a huge amount to do with that.
Yeah, LIFT is going to be helping with the development modeling and financial modeling. So. Yeah. All right, talk soon.
Talk to you soon.
Next Economy Now is a production of LIFT Economy. LIFT is an impact consulting firm whose mission is to create, model, and share a locally self-reliant economy that works for the benefit of all life. To listen to all of our past episodes or to share your thoughts about the show, visit www.lifteconomy.com/podcast. You can also subscribe to this podcast through iTunes, Overcast, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. Please take a moment to rate us on iTunes It's helpful in allowing these ideas to reach a wider audience. And once again, thanks for listening.